Pixie by Gary Ives. Read by Gary Ives. I'm a small person. I yearn to be bigger, and early on realized how a uniform put a person perceptibly larger in the eyes of others. It helped that I'd been in love with the Army since I could remember. Posters of Audie Murphy and Uncle Sam hung on the wall of my little room. However, through these 6 decades and more, I have, alas, remained a small person. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was an answer to my prayer. Uncle Sam did indeed want me. At 59 1/2 inches tall and 98 pounds, I barely met the Army's physical requirements. But I made it and arrived in basic training certainly the most thankful person there. All the intimidation that boot camp serves, I'd expected. And none of the yelling or marching or drilling in the rain could outweigh my appreciation of belonging that I felt for my boot camp company, which was the real thing, the real Army. Belonging to this was 10 times better than any school club or church. We were this bunch of guys from all over the country who had joined up to fight for our country, by God, and what good guys, too. This was the first time I'd been around blacks, and in boot camp I learned that despite what I'd heard all my life about blacks, they were no different than whites. I came out of boot camp infantry training clean and proud, and was soon aboard the troop ship to General Geiger at Long Beach. Off we sailed across the wide Pacific to Hawaii, Guam, and then Cameron Bay, Republic of Vietnam. There in the staging area for trucks, Sonny and Cher were singing "The Beat Goes on some GI's portable radio. The year was 1966, and I had 2 legs and 2 balls, and yes, I felt bigger than ever. 2nd Platoon, Easy Company, called itself the Clyde Platoon, a name lifted from that Bonnie and Clyde movie. The boss was Lieutenant Lionel Fiskey, but everybody called him Jesus, as he was a Bible thumper. He was the replacement for a lieutenant sent home with some hellish intestinal parasite. Our true leader was First Sergeant Sutton, who was a hard-ass black dude who everybody called First Sergeant. Jesus, having much to learn, realized First Sergeant's station and stuck to him like a leech. About half the Clydes had been in country nearly their full year. First Sergeant and 6 others were on second tours, all their in-country time together. Easy Company patrolled in rough mountains, from the base camp atop a mountain called Calvary, originally secured by a Special Forces company who had crucified 3 VC who had penetrated their perimeter one night. A gruesome Polaroid of the 3 crosses with the crucified VC was passed around the entire company. I remember hoping that the poor fuckers were dead before being hung up on those crosses. Easy Company's job was to send out patrols from Calvary to interrupt Ho Chi Minh Trail traffic. The famous Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was not a single select path through the mountains. Rather, it was any north-south route used to funnel men and supplies from the north. There were 2 villages at the base of Calvary, tiny An Kap at the south foot and Bing Ga at the north. We called them Andy Cap and Bingo. Andy Cap was just a few huts with 1 carabao and a couple of dogs. The Army had relocated 100 or so Andy Cap villagers from their true home some miles to the north. 1st and 3rd Platoon patrolled the northern sectors and said there was a little market in Bingo with pussy to be had for cash. We always passed by Andy Cap on our way out on patrol sectors, but there was nothing there. The slopes were afraid of us and would disappear before we ever got close. The last lieutenant had ignored the village. Jesus wanted to parley with the village chief, but could never find him. On my first patrol, First Sergeant put me with Corporal Johnson, one of the oldsters, who kept on my ass. "Get your ass up off the ground, damn it. You got to check out the horizon. Always be ready for a signal from Point or from First Sergeant. I'm looking for tripwires or snakes." "Fuck them tripwires and fuck them snakes too. Tripwires and snakes is for them assholes up front. Don't be worried none about no tripwires and snakes. Now shut your mouth, Pixie, and start paying attention." That's what he called me, Pixie. And this went around, and soon enough Pixie was my name. It beat Pee-wee or Shrimp or Cookie back in high school. Yeah, with the Clydes, I was Pixie. My name was the only thing memorable to come out of my first patrol. On my second patrol, the Clyde set up an ambush for a column of VC that had been spotted from the air. Just before we left, in the still, dark, early morning, First Sergeant went over each position and made sure the new guys understood hand signals. In addition to my pack, I carried 2 extra barrels for the M60s. Our coordinates were 12 clicks through thick foliage, hot as hell, and so humid it was like a spider crawling underneath a hot, wet dish rag. I did not complain. I wanted Corporal Johnson and First Sergeant to know I was a soldier, not a pussy. As we set the crossfire positions with the 2 M60s, First Sergeant and Jesus checked out each man, his weapon, his instructions, and in an OD ditty bag, First Sergeant collected every cigarette in the platoon. Ain't gonna be no noise, ain't gonna be no movement, and ain't gonna be no smoke till this here party is done and over with. Now snug into your concealed positions, ladies, and wait. It was only an hour, but it felt like 3 or 4 hours waiting. Waiting to scratch and itch, or swat legions of bugs. But we all did what Corporal Johnson called assholing. "Just tighten up your asshole every few minutes," Corporal Johnson whispered. "Flex the muscles in your legs. Wiggle your toes. That's assholing. Keep you from stiffing." The ambush popped just after noon. The column had come trotting along the river to the ford, where we had positioned the deadly crossfire. It was over in less than 2 minutes. The sun was directly overhead, and I remember sunbeams reflecting off the running water so brightly it hurt my eyes as we crept out of the thick green foliage like deer. Up ahead I heard the popping of First Sergeant's .45, sending the wounded on to their next reincarnations. The only dead body I'd ever seen was my granddad's viewing. The dead along the creek were different, mostly small, young, and skinny like me, and sprawled out in the water and along the banks in black pajamas all chewed up by the 7.62 rounds. Even though they were fresh dead, the flies knew. They knew right away, and it was ugly to see the heavy, iridescent green flies on their eyes and noses, crawling into their open mouths as we smoked our cigarettes, while we searched the bodies ostensibly for papers for G2, but also for loot. I looked until I found the smallest VC, smaller by inches than me. He had been one of the wounded. First Sergeant had shot the back of his head off with the .45. The slug had crushed his skull and blown off much of his face. I could not tell what he looked like or his expression when he died, though I imagined his face to be young and pretty. His hands were elegant, which made me think he may have been a musician or an artist. Had he spent afternoons in his parents' house in Saigon or Hue practicing piano, violin? Had he a girlfriend, buddies? I imagined his mother weeping at the piano, or before the violin placed behind votive candles with his picture. His pack contained only a half-eaten rice ball and 3 mortar rounds. Nothing personal. The few rings and watches among the other dead, any little souvenir easily carried, disappeared pronto. I took nothing, as it would be like stealing something from church. Most of what the VC carried was ammo and balls of sticky rice wrapped up in leaves. And sadly, snapshots. A dark blue, yet vaguely sacred, sweet melancholy came on to me. We had to hurry to make it back before dark. So we collected their weapons and ammo, leaving the enemy dead to the green and blue flies and night critters. The Clydes were pumped up by the success of the ambush. At chow, Corporal Johnson told Cobb and Price, "Pixie got blood on his boots. Now he a warrior," and laughed. I'd not fired my rifle. The M60s had done it all, but blood on the boots? Yes, there was blood on my boots. "Hey, you earn your $65 combat pay today, Pixie." Presence at the successful combat confirmed my status as a true Clyde. I hadn't freaked or pissed all over myself, and they had conferred upon me my tribal name. We were all in this together, we killers. Clyde's 12, Gook's 0, someone had chalked on the latrine. My skin was army, but inside I reckoned myself a pussy. I'd seen enough slopes to know how small they were, but death diminished them further, and it ate at me that the Clydes, so large in their gloating, ignored this distinction in size. It was David and Goliath, but with Goliath winning. The image of my own dead little Charlie, the musician, persisted. What had those in his patrol called him? This I kept to my pussy self. Corporal Hale, our radio operator, was the largest Clyde by weight. He was called Heavy. He was very funny, and I liked him well enough, but I did not like to sit across from him or his buddy Dieter at chow. Both were voracious eaters, and the pair had this gross-out trick that they'd pull when they wanted to beg desserts. They'd open wide their mouths full of chewed food, then talk in funny voices to each other. It was disgusting. I estimated Corporal Hale easily weighed more than twice my weight. On patrol he carried a .45, but he had to link 2 web belts together to get the pistol belt around his girth. When my first night patrol was assigned, we drew a new sector that had been reconnoitered only from the air. With 4 patrols behind, I was no longer a new guy, but I still harbored a fear of tripwires and snakes. We'd seen both during the day. On that first night patrol, the Clydes found a lean-to with a long wire antenna rig, but no enemy. The next night we drew a search and destroy patrol. Corporal Hale carried a receiver that could scan for Charlie's signals and give us an idea of proximity, but not direction. Near the site of the long wire discovery, a signal was picked up, and First Sergeant put pairs in spiraling circular search mode. A light rain had brought out the ponchos. My partner Dieter, one of the old hands near the end of his second tour, slipped in mud, losing his balance, sliding quickly down the muddy trail into a punji pit. His screams brought in all the Clydes. The pit was shallow and smelled of fresh human shit that Charlie had pitched upon the stakes. Extracting him was difficult. One fire-hardened, sharpened bamboo stake pierced Dieter's thigh, another, clear through his lower back, came out through his navel. First Sergeant and our medic rigged straps from our belts to lift him. He never quit the noise. The heels of his boots dug in as he arched his back to scream while the doc hovered over the wounds. First Sergeant clapped his hand over Dieter's mouth until Doc passed him a bandage pack, and he shoved that into his mouth to silence him, but Dieter didn't last long. Doc said his kidney probably been pierced and he most likely bled to death. First Sergeant turned and barked orders. "Stinson, Johnson, set up perimeter, hurry. I want the M60s pointed the way we came, and over there, this way. Hurry, goddammit. Lock and load, ladies. Let's circle the wagons. Everyone in position." So we waited, assholing the rest of the night, expecting an attack, which never came. Waiting for an attack, I felt like a true soldier, though I'd fired my weapon not once in combat. At first light, we carried Dieter back, wrapped in his poncho, through the wet jungle. We all took turns with the improvised stretcher. Death did not seem to diminish Dieter's body. Maybe this was because I could not see the corpse under the poncho. There were no flies, none of the sweet sorrow that I'd felt at the ambush at the ford. Dead Dieter was just Dieter, whom I knew as someone with bad acne from Philadelphia. This lack of sentiment caused me to feel guilty, so I tried to imagine Dieter's world as I had my little VC musician, but the images were ugly. Dieter with his deck of porno playing cards. Dieter the time we were in the back of the Deuce and a Half when he threw empty beer cans at the mama-san on the bicycle. Dieter talking loud with his mouth full of food. I felt worse for such disrespect for the dead, a dead Clyde at that. Luther Stinson, another private, and I became buddies. Like me, he was a slender boy from Arkansas, but he was very tall, and he was black. He had an economy of motion which set him apart from the rest of the Clydes, to whom quietude and less on patrol seemed an anathema. He said we were like puppies jumping in a box, always squirming and yapping. He was a first-rate carpenter and mechanic, too. He could fix just about anything. This and his easygoing manner gained him a universal popularity. He had a little chess set which folded up, and nightly we would play one game after chow. We were evenly matched, and the games gave us much pleasure. He planned to finish school and then teach math in some small high school. I'm here for the GI Bill. That's all, man. How about you? What do you want to do? He laughed when I told him that I'd stay in the Army, but then said, "That's good. Very good, Pixie." I did not know why he thought so, but his approval pleased me. He had a little Vietnamese language book he studied and sometimes sat to practice speaking with the mama-sons that cleaned our hooches. One of them, Ko-an, he'd become sweet on. Ever wonder why the girls always laugh when Corporal Hale goes by? In Vietnamese, his name sounds like their word for pig. Corporal Pig, can you dig it? Night watches were stood from a sandbagged 12-foot tower with a searchlight that overlooked Calvary's perimeter. That was protected by coils of concertina wire, with beer cans dangling throughout the entire circuit. The tower was a two-man post. One soldier on the mounted M60 or M79 while the other worked the searchlight and was free to crank the siren. I liked the 4-hour night watch because it was quiet. About the only disturbance came from wild pigs that sometimes rooted our garbage dump. You knew it wasn't Charlie on account of the racket the pigs made. Stinson and I drew our watches together and we stood the midnight 4 watch. Halfway through at 2 a.m. we'd share a box of sea rats and then a joint. Stinson had a girlfriend who sent him rolled joints in a little harmonica case. Later there was all manner of homegrown in-country, but 1966 was early on. Most everybody, including the NCOs, were down with pot. First Sergeant knew it. It was all over the place. He knew everything. But I don't remember him ever addressing it as an issue. Corporal Johnson said First Sergeant never drank, but liked to smoke. Smoke was kept far and wide from Jesus, who was hell on drunks. These long, free nights in the watchtower brought Stinson and me together. Some nights our low, quiet talk filled the whole 4 hours. Other nights we barely spoke. But we drew together as men at war will. As he learned more of the language, he had begun speaking with the anti-cap men we employed to dig, empty latrines, and haul water. These laborers ate their lunch in the shade of a mango tree, and Stinson would often, for practice, join them, squatting back on his heels in their fashion, chattering away like a monkey. One day, Jesus saw Stinson give 2 D-cell flashlight batteries to one of these men. He called him over behind the bunker to chew ass. I happened to have been down in the bunker, and I heard him. Jesus knew that Stinson enjoyed much prestige, so the ass chew was pedantic rather than his usual shave-tail imitation DI bullshit. Stinson, I'm sure you know that these batteries can be used to detonate a mine, huh? Oh, yes, sir. Then how do you know, soldier, that your friends over there aren't VC, or at least VC sympathizers? Lieutenant Onwa there, he's their boss. He can't get batteries for Andy Cap's one flashlight. I reckon every flashlight battery in the country goes to the R-vans. Andy Cap is neither here nor there, soldier. I see anything like this again, I'll have you up on charges. You understand? Yes, sir. Dismissed. That night on watch, he told me that Andy Cap had one flashlight that hung from a ring on a post that villagers using the privy at night could see. The year before, a woman had been snake bit at night. No use trying to explain. Jesus means well, but he's got his head up his ass like most of these other yo-yos. He hates these folks because he's afraid of them. I understand that. This is one fucked up situation, Pixie. One super duper fuck story. You got to admit, he's got a point. I mean about the batteries finding their way to the VC. So what? You know what's really wrong here, Pixie? Humanity, kindness, compassion, decency are all covered up by this shitbag fuck story of a war. These little people just trying to fill their rice bowls get shoved around and shit on day after day. First they got the fucking VC coming around collecting taxes, carrying their boys off. Then here we come. Big hairy fuckers with helicopters and airplanes telling them what they can and can't do. Making them move out of their ancestral villages. For what? So we can have a clear line of fire? At least the VC were their own kind. These poor people are fucked coming and going. Shit, to them, we're probably no better than the Japs were. And now, here we go bombing rice paddies and bridges and even Hanoi, up north. Hanoi, for Christ's sake, that's a fucking city, Pixie. A city filled with civilians, women, babies. For what? Jesus gets pissed because Andy Caps won't talk to him. Hey, Sherlock, ever think maybe they just might hate us? Oh, fuck no, you can't hate Americans. No, we're over here to save your ass. That's how come we burn your villages and make you relocate and fuck your daughters for $4 and sea rats. I reckon it's the communists' fault, Stinson. They started it. They take Vietnam, then what? Cambodia, Singapore, Australia? We can't have that, buddy. We got to save these people from communism. So who's going to save us from capitalism? You ever thought of that? Communism, capitalism, socialism, fuck all isms. They're all a fuck story. How about a shitload of decencyism, respectism, leave me the fuck aloneism? We don't got to save anybody but ourselves. Ourselves, Pixie, ourselves. That fat-ass fucking Kissinger's over there in Paris clucking and crowing about whether the peace talks table's going to be round or rectangle, while we spew napalm and high fucking explosives all over little people north and south. Those fuckers don't want to see this war end. War is profit. How many senators and congressmen and their power-worshipping goddamn fairy aides you reckon hold stocks in Dow Chemical or Olin Matheson or Monsanto? They're waxing fat, they are, while we're bleeding. Fuck 'em, Pixie. Fuck 'em all. Now tell me we don't have some real sorry-ass atonement up ahead. What would you do if you were in charge, Stinson? Oh, that's easy. First I'd call a ceasefire, send all our troops home. Then I'd apologize to the Vietnamese and the rest of the world. Then I'd send a team of engineers to Andy Cap to install a generator and wire the village for electricity. Then I'd ram 2 D-cells up Lieutenant Jesus' ass and light me a giant spliff. That's what I'd do, Pixie. Going out on our next patrol, Jesus told Stinson to rouse the village chief on Andy Cap. But all the men, including the village chief, were back at Calvary that morning digging new mortar pits. Only women remained in the village. An older woman, with whom Stinson tried to communicate, refused to converse. preferring to scream unintelligible invectives at Stinson and Jesus. "If she isn't a VC sympathizer, I'm a monkey's uncle," Jesus said. On our way back from patrol, a one-shot Charlie sniper put a slug into Corporal Hale's PRC 76. Everyone heard Jesus tell First Sergeant that woman had no doubt alerted the VC to our location. "First Sergeant, short of burning handicap, I want a lesson taught to these people." He ordered Corporal Hale to take out the village's one water buffalo. To his credit, Corporal Hale dropped the huge beast with one shot between the eyes. "Hamburger tonight, zipperheads." On my last night patrol, Corporal Johnson's boot met a bouncing Betty's tripwire. Our medic called in the dust-off, which carried me to the field hospital on the coast, where surgeons took off my left leg below the knee, wired up my jaw, and sewed up the mess that was my scrotum. My left nut is still rolling around somewhere below Calvary. Recovering from the amputation, I was not only immobile, but mute too. Shrapnel from Betty had smashed part of my jaw, which the doctors had reconstructed. There I lay, wired shut, confined to bed, and unable to communicate beyond grunts. As the morphine was stepped down to Darvon, my head began to clear, and the realization of the loss emerged. However, the hot fog of pain occluded just about everything. I was locked within myself with no exit, concentration impossible. I conceived harsh images of the pain as glowing hot knots of cords where the leg had been. And every time the generators outside surged, bolts of pain shot through the knotted cords. Bizarre, vivid dreams repeated themselves and racked my sleep. My faceless, dead VC boy plodded through the jungle, my leg in his pack, and my nut nestled deep in his wrapped rice ball. In another dream, carrying Dieter back to Calvary, his corpse became longer and heavier until we could not bear the weight. First Sergeant rigged our belts into drag lines, 10 GIs to a line, hauling the huge body tied within the poncho. At Calvary, Corporal Johnson and the doc ran the bundled corpse through a sawmill, which turned Dieter into stacks of 2x4s. These dreams have continued to visit me for 40 years. My hoped-for Army career ended at Valley Forge General Hospital in Pennsylvania, with a prosthetic leg, Purple Heart, and a bus ticket home to Arkansas, where I have spent 35 years working for the United States Postal Service. Stinson and I have remained friends. Stinson's DD-214 will show that he left the service honorably, having served in combat tour in Vietnam, and that he suffered no wounds. But I know better. He was different. Unlike the rest of us Clydes, he remained numb to the filthy politics of war, half blind to the happenings around us, and impervious to the guilt we all bore. Stinson bore that guilt for us. After his discharge, he began school in Missouri on the GI Bill. During his last semester, he was arrested with half an ounce in a federal sting operation aimed at his supplier. It was an election year, filled with get tough on crime promises. And my good friend Stinson, the black man, drew a 10 years federal prison sentence. His hopes to teach ended. He served 4 years at a federal minimum security prison 70 miles away, where I was able to visit regularly. For a short while after his release, he lived with my wife and me, but eventually moved in with a woman who ran a boarding kennel. By the time that relationship went south, Stinson's period of parole was up. He signed up with a mining company that sent him overseas to faraway western Indonesia. His letters were beautifully written. For the first year, he lived in a Connex box and worked a drag line, mining gold and copper ores. Like Vietnamese, he loved the Melanesian people and dove into learning their language, eventually marrying a Melanesian. The day he discovered that Henry Kissinger was a major stockholder in the mining company, he walked off the job. Later that year, I was questioned by the FBI, who asked to see our correspondence. I burned Stinson's beautiful letters rather than hand them over. He had involved himself in his people's independence movement and once again found himself on the wrong side of American foreign policy. He disappeared with his wife's people deep into the bush. Only years later, when Irian Jaya achieved independence from Indonesia, did we hear from Stinson. He had declined the new government's offer to become Minister of Education in favor of teaching in a village school where he remains today, the father of 3. Last year, my wife and I visited him and his family. I am a small man, but I am most fortunate in that this giant is my friend.